Hi guys, it's Miss Lipston. I'm going to have a tripod here in the next couple of days, so it'll be a little bit easier to do all of my filming. Today, for our reading lesson, we are going to read Enemy Pie, okay? And just like we have done in the classroom and before, we got to remember a couple of things through the story, and then at the end, we're going to fill out our graphic organizer. But in the middle of the story, I want us to use our story hand. That's going to help us remember who the characters are. The setting, remember the setting is where the story happens. What happens in the beginning of the story, the middle, and the end. And then we'll be able to put those things up into our graphic organizers. Up here we'll be drawing and writing our characters, drawing and writing our setting, drawing and writing what happened in the beginning, the middle, and the end. Okay? All right, here we go. Enemy Pie. It should have been a perfect summer. My dad helped me build a tree house in our backyard. My sister was at camp for 3 whole weeks, and I was on the best baseball team in town. It should have been perfect. It should have been a perfect summer, but it wasn't. It was good until Jeremy Ross moved into the neighborhood, right next door to my best friend Stanley. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me when he struck me out in the baseball game. He had a party on his trampoline and I wasn't even invited. But my best friend Stanley was. Jeremy Ross was the one and only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list until he moved into the neighborhood. But as soon as he came along, I needed one. I hung it up in my treehouse where Jeremy Ross was not allowed to go. Dad understood stuff like enemies. He told me that when he was my age, he had an enemy too, but he knew of a way to get rid of them. I asked him to tell me how. Tell you how? I'll show you how, he said. He pulled out a really old recipe book off of the kitchen shelf. Inside, there was a worn-out scrap of paper with a faded writing. Dad held it up and squinted at it. Enemy Pie, he said. All right, so before we turn the page, let's think of who our characters are. We have the boy, we have Dad, and we have Jeremy Ross, okay? So that's something that we got to remember. So those will be our characters at the end of the story, all right? You may be wondering, what exactly is Enemy Pie? I was wondering too. But Dad said the recipe was so secret, he couldn't even tell me. I decided it must be magic. I begged him to tell me something, anything. I will tell you this, he said. Enemy Pie is the fastest known way to get rid of enemies. Now, of course, this got my mind working. What kinds of things, disgusting things, would I put into a pie for an enemy? I brought Dad some weeds from the garden, and he just shook his head. I brought him earthworms and rocks, but he didn't think he'd need those either. I gave him the gum I'd been chewing all morning. He gave it right back to me. I went out to play alone. I shot baskets until the ball got stuck up on the roof. I threw a boomerang that never came back to me. And all the while, I listened to the sounds of my dad chopping, stirring, and blending the ingredients of Enemy Pie. This could be a great summer after all. Enemy Pie was going to be awful. I tried to imagine how horrible it must smell, or even worse yet, what it would look like. But when I was in the backyard looking for ladybugs, I smelled something really, really good. And as far as I could tell, it was coming from our kitchen. I was a bit confused. I went in to ask Dad what was wrong. Enemy Pie shouldn't smell this good. But Dad, he was smart. If Enemy Pie smelled bad, your enemy would never eat it, he said. I could tell he'd made Enemy Pie before. The buzzer rang and Dad put on his oven mitts and pulled out the pie. It looked like plain old pie. It looked good enough to eat. I was catching on. But still, I wasn't really sure how this Enemy Pie worked. What exactly did it do to enemies? Maybe it made their hair fall out, or their breath stinky? Maybe it made big bullies cry. I asked Dad and he was no help. He wouldn't tell me a thing. But while the pie cooled, he did fill me on my job. He talked quietly. There's one part of Enemy Pie that I can't do, And in order for it to work, you need to spend the day with your enemy. Even worse, you have to be nice to him. It's not easy, but that's the only way that enemy pie can work. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Oh, of course I was. It sounded horrible. It sounded scary, but it was worth a try. All I had to do was spend one day with Jeremy Ross. Then he'd be out of my hair for the rest of my life. I rode my bike to his house and knocked on the door. Jeremy Ross opened the door and he seemed surprised. He stood on the other side of the screen door and looked at me, waiting for me to say something. I was nervous. Can you play? I asked. He looked confused. I'll go ask my mom, he said. He came back with his shoes in his hand. His mom walked around the corner to say hello. You boys, stay out of trouble, she said, smiling. We rode bikes for a while and played on the trampoline. And then we made some water balloons and threw them at the neighbor girls. But we missed. Jeremy's mom made us lunch, and after lunch we went over to my house. It was strange, but I was kind of having fun with my enemy. He almost seemed nice, but of course I couldn't tell Dad that, since he had worked so hard making enemy pie. Jeremy Ross liked my basketball hoop. He said he had wished he'd had a basketball hoop, but that they didn't have room for one. I let him win a game, just to be nice. Jeremy knew how to throw a boomerang. He threw it, and it came back to him. I threw it, and it went over my house and into the backyard. When we climbed over the fence to find it, the first thing Jeremy noticed was my treehouse. My treehouse. It was my treehouse. I was the boss. If my sister wanted in, I didn't have to let her. If my dad wanted in, I didn't have to let him either. And if Jeremy wanted in, can I go in, he asked. I knew he was going to ask me that, but he was the top person, the only person on my enemy list. And enemies, they're not allowed in my treehouse. But he did teach me to throw a boomerang, and he did have me over for lunch, and he did play with me on the trampoline. He wasn't being a very good enemy. Okay, I said, but hold on. I climbed up ahead of him and tore the enemy list off the wall. I had a checkerboard and some cards in the treehouse, and we played games until my dad called us down for dinner. We pretended we didn't hear him. When he came out to get us, we tried to hide from him, but somehow he found us. Dad made us macaroni and cheese for dinner, my favorite. It was Jeremy's favorite, too. Maybe Jeremy Ross wasn't so bad after all. I was beginning to think that maybe we should just forget about enemy pie. But sure enough, after dinner, Dad brought out the pie. I watched as he cut the pie into 8 thick slices. Dad, I said, it sure is nice having a new friend in the neighborhood. I was trying to get his attention and trying to tell him that Jeremy Ross was no longer my enemy. But Dad smiled and nodded, and I think he thought I was just pretending. Dad dished up 3 plates side by side with big pieces of pie and giant scoops of ice cream. He passed one to me, one to Jeremy. Wow, Jeremy said, look at the pie. My dad never makes pies like this. It was at this point I panicked. I did not want Jeremy to eat enemy pie. He was my friend. I couldn't let him eat it. Jeremy, don't eat it. It's a bad pie. I think it's poisonous or something. Jeremy's fork stopped right before it reached his mouth, crumbled his eyebrows, and he looked at me funny. I felt relieved. I had saved his life. I was a hero. If it's so bad, Jeremy asked, then why has your dad already eaten half of it? I turned to look at my dad. Sure enough, he was eating enemy pie. Good stuff, he mumbled through a mouthful, and that was all he said. I was sat there watching them eat enemy pie for a few seconds. Dad was laughing. Jeremy was happily eating, and neither of them was losing any hair. Seemed safe enough, so I took a teeny tiny taste. Enemy pie was delicious. After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline in the morning. He said he'd teach me how to flip. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make it. I still wonder if enemies really do hate it, or if their hair falls out, or if their breath turns really bad. But I don't know. I guess I'll never get that answer, because I just lost my best enemy. All right, the end. All right, so we talked about the characters, okay? I'm going to grab some markers over here. We're going to grab some different colors to make it really easy, and I'm hoping that you guys can still see me, okay? So our characters, what characters did we say were in the story? We had the boy, the dad, and Jeremy Ross. Okay, so we have the boy, Jeremy Ross, and then the dad. Okay, so boy. We have Jeremy. And we have dad. Okay, so those are our three characters. Where did the story happen? It's basically in their neighborhood or at their house, right? So we can draw over here. Let's draw a bunch of houses so it's like a neighborhood. Okay. Right? And they had bikes. Okay. That is the setting. Okay. Now, what was the very first part of the story? Jeremy moved into town, right? And he had to make an enemy list. So that was the very first thing that he had to do. He made his enemy list. Okay? And Jeremy's name was on it. All right? What happened in the middle of the story? He had to try to be friends with him for the day. Remember, that's his dad. While his dad baked the pie. Let's draw Dad here. Let's put a chef hat on him. Right? And he's making this pie. And it smells good. Okay? And then the boys are having to play together. What kinds of things did they play in the middle of the story? Did they throw a boomerang? Right? Those. They also got to play basketball, so let's draw basketball. I think they look like that, right? Okay? And they were both having a really great time, weren't they? Okay. And then what happened at the very end? I think the boy told Jeremy, don't eat that pie, because they became friends, right? So what if we drew a picture, and they're sitting at the table, and he's saying, no! Right? No! And he's like mid-bite. Remember how he had the fork? Like that? Okay. There we go. And they were both having their pie, slices of pie. All right. And they became best friends. Nice job, guys. I hope you guys were able to do that. Now, if you can also, I'm going to flip you guys around. Whoop. There we go. Maybe. If you guys can read another story on your own, any of your Erla books or any of those kinds of things, and do the same thing. Thinking of your story hand, thinking of our graphic organizer, okay? What happened in the story? The beginning, the middle, and the end. Who are the characters and where did it happen? All right. Thanks, guys. See you later.